I want to tell you a little about our guests. Ariel, Layla, and Osprey are joining us from COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland, where the formal proceedings are dismal and depressing. Inside, they're doing what Greta Thunberg aptly described as more blah, blah, blah. But the informal activist events seem to be growing and are filled with outrage, creativity, and determination, diversity, collaboration, and courage. Each of our speakers have attended multiple COP events before, so they have some experience of their evolution. Also, each of them have mobilized divest movements, lobbied government officials, brought delegations to COP, and written extensively on these topics. So we've got a really deep resource here to be thankful for, and I'm so grateful to have them all here together with us. Ariel Tsequi Deranger is a member of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation in Canada and a leading global figure in Indigenous rights and climate justice activism. She is the co-founder and executive director of Indigenous Climate Action and is a member of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. She is also, for full disclosure, the chair of Bioneers' board of directors. Layla Salazar-Lopez is the executive director of Amazon Watch. She has worked for over 20 years to defend the world's rainforests, human rights, and the climate through grassroots organizing and international advocacy campaigns at a stunning array of highly regarded U.S. nonprofits. She is also a Global Fund for Women advisor for Latin America. Osprey Aurea Lake is founder and executive director of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network International, also known as WECAN. She works with grassroots and Indigenous leaders, policymakers, and scientists to promote climate justice, resilient communities, and a just transition to a democratized energy future. She also serves on the executive committee for the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature and is the author of the award-winning book, Uprisings for the Earth, Reconnecting Culture with Nature. Now, great women, I want to invite you in that order to share your reflections from attending the COP this year and to say what, if anything, is different in this time of increased urgency? And how are your experiences there affecting your vision or planning moving forward? You'll each take about 5 minutes, and our colleague Marita will support us with links for resources about your work in the chat. Each of your, let me pause now and hand it to our great panel. Starting with Ariel.
My name is, again, Ariel Tsequi Deranger, and I'm a member of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation. I just introduced myself in my language, which is Dene or Dene Sotlane. And I'm from Northern Alberta in so-called Canada, Treaty 8 territory. And I'm really excited and happy to be here. And it's always so lovely to see you, Nina. And it's just so amazing to see the evolution of Bioneers shifting and pivoting in this time of COVID and climate crisis to really make sure that our voices are heard from the COP, but all the wonderful messages that come out of Bioneers. So thank you so much for having me.
My honor.
So I think, so just to get this right, we're going to answer that first question to start off with. Okay. Yeah. I think when we're talking about the climate justice movement and what's happening right now, we really need to start thinking about not just reducing emissions. I think this is the big thing. We're talking about the fact that our planet is in disrepair. We're talking about the fact that we have created a crisis of epic proportions where every single living thing on this planet is being impacted by the mistakes of the human species. But moreover, it's not just about humanity, it's about all life on this planet. And at Indigenous Climate Action, the work that we do is more focused and centered around people and the responsibilities that we have to not just address the climate crisis by looking at reducing emissions, because when we reduce the climate crisis to just a mathematical equation of reducing emissions and looking at the GHGs, we lose the humanity, we lose the relationships that are critical and important. So I'm Dene, or Dene Sotlene. And when you take the name Dene and you break down that word and you pull it apart, a lot of our people say it means people of the land. But when you break it down even more, the actual definition means to flow from the earth, to flow from the earth. And it's that deep rooted connection and identities that we have as Indigenous peoples that is part and parcel to why 80% of the world's biodiversity is within the hands of Indigenous peoples, as Nina stated earlier on. And so when we look at climate justice, we have to look at those intersections of those relationships, not just with each other, but with the land, and the effects that the climate crisis has created on those relationships. We have to look at what are those root causes of those systems that have brought us to this place. And the articulations of our organization is that colonialism, capitalism, extractivism, and systems of patriarchy are responsible for the climate crisis that we are in. These are the systems that are responsible for putting forward systems that have destabilized our landscapes, that have removed forcibly and violently Indigenous peoples from their homelands and ripped those lands apart, poisoned them, contaminated them. These are the same systems that have tried to commodify everything in the living world. So much so that when we are looking at the climate crisis, we're now looking at commodifying the atmosphere, commodifying every little biodiversity in the world so that we can look at ways to trade those living beings. We are at rock bottom. The final clutches of capitalism and colonialism are trying to claw their way and keep themselves there. But the beauty that we are witnessing within this crisis is the power of community. The power of Indigenous peoples to bring forth their knowledge systems, their identities, their cultures, their ways of being forward into the forefront, and demand not just recognition via lip service, but that we be empowered to guide forward solutions that are rooted in those deep relationships of what it means to be Dene, to flow from the land, to flow from the earth. This is the solutions that we need in order to right our relationships with all of our relatives, the ones that fly, the ones on four legs, the ones that swim in the waters, to the insects, to the trees, to the plants and the medicines, to the rivers that flow, to the mountains, to the sky, to the moon and the sun, and the galaxy beyond. Those relationships will guide us with stories. Those relationships will guide us in ways that when we listen, when we truly listen to the words of the natural living world, when we learn to understand that language once again, we will have righted that relationship and we will be able to find solutions that bring us forward. And I'd be remiss if I didn't note it, or I didn't note to the fact that it is women. And that is part of this rebalancing of the natural world. We are seeing women rise up. This imbalance of patriarchy has created the imbalances we're seeing on the planet, and we must reclaim our places in society as women, as Indigenous peoples, to balance those relationships. Because we can't just balance GHGs, we have to be talking about balancing all of the systems that have been out of balance for the last 500 plus years. And I'm so excited for all of the amazing work that's being done in social movement spaces, including in the outside spaces here at the COP26 in Scotland, where I have witnessed numerous events of Indigenous peoples and people of color rising up and saying enough is enough. They're calling and demanding that we phase out of all fossil fuels. They are demanding no false solutions, no carbon markets, no conservation offsets. They are saying we need real zero, not net zero, not offset programs that allow big polluters to pay. They're demanding language and safeguards for human rights, indigenous rights, gender and justice. We're talking about creating mechanisms that redistribute the wealth and the responsibilities of high polluting nations to ensure that everyone has an equitable, fair share moving forward. Without those voices, and many of them, so many of them, strong, incredible, powerful women, we would have false deals on the table and we would not be moving forward towards progress of addressing the climate crisis. So I just feel so empowered to sit on this panel with Osprey and Layla and Nina and be able to just get into this conversation around what climate justice really means. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariel. That was awesome and so true. Layla, sorry you have to follow that, but I know you're up for it.
Good evening, everyone. It is evening. It's 9 o'clock here in Glasgow. So once again, my name is Layla Salazar-Lopez. I'm Chicana Latina from California. And first and foremost, I just want to say that I do feel that while the inside, right, the inside of the COP feels like a giant trade show, the outside feels like the real deal. It feels like there's so much going on here. I mean, so, and bear with me as this is the second week of non-stop events. From the moment we set foot here, from the moment we got here on October 30th. We've been pretty much nonstop at numerous events with Indigenous peoples of the Amazon and Indigenous peoples of the North and South, and building solidarity between the North and South. That's always one of our key focuses. So at Amazon Watch, and we've been attending the COPs since Copenhagen. Myself, personally, I've been attending since COP, COP 15 in Cancun. And I remember taking my 1-year-old baby there to Cancun. And at that time, it seems like the conversations that are happening inside the COP are pretty much the same conversations that we're having today. To me personally, it doesn't feel that the inside space has changed very much. It seems that as though, whether it was, back then it was REDD+ and REDD, reducing emissions for deforestation and degradation. Today it's net zero, it's offsets, it's finance. It seems like the conversations are dominated by finance and how much the commitments, the big pledges. Seems like every day there's announcements of pledges and commitments, which is what we want. Of course, we're here because the planet is on fire. We're here because we're in a climate emergency. I live in California. I live in San Francisco, Ohlone territory. And for the last few years, we have felt the impacts of the fires, of the wildfires. And we've felt the firsthand feelings and tragedies of what climate chaos and the climate emergency is. And everywhere, we feel climate chaos, from California to the Amazon, to New Orleans, to Australia, to Alberta. We are feeling climate chaos. And so we came here not because we want to go to another conference, not because we want to go to a big trade show, because that's what it feels like there. We came here because We want action. We want justice. We know that if we do not urgently act at this time, we being all of us, we being our global leaders, our elected leaders, and all of us who are here speaking for so many, speaking for our communities, for our families, for those that we work in solidarity with. And there have been many pledges here made to protect forests, to invest in Indigenous peoples. And in a way, that's what we've asked for, right? We have made the case over the years that protecting the Amazon, protecting forests, that there is no climate solution without protecting forests. There is no climate solution without protecting the Amazon rainforest, the hydrological cycle of our planet. And the best way to do that is by standing with, supporting Indigenous peoples, amplifying Indigenous peoples, the voices, the solutions, the resistance of Indigenous peoples on the front lines in the Amazon and everywhere. And so the commitments that are being made in a way are in response to that demand, but what we haven't heard is how. We've heard a lot of commitments about focusing on forest finance and Indigenous peoples, but I can tell you that the Indigenous peoples of the Amazon that we stand with are asking how. How is that? How are those millions and billions that are being pledged going to reach the communities? Right now, they're deals to governments. They're deals to governments like Ecuador that is doubling extraction of fossil fuels in the Amazon. There is no discussion of just extraction at the COP. And if we don't address extraction, we don't have a chance. And so that's why we're inside, and that's why we're also outside. And of all the COPs that I've attended over the years, I can definitely say that this COP felt like definitely has had the most presence of Indigenous people from the Amazon. The Brazilian delegation of APIB, the Association of Indigenous Peoples of Brazil, and ANMIGA, which is the Indigenous Women's Articulation of Brazil, that recently had a massive march in Brasilia in defense of land and bodies and territories, and proposing the reforesting of the mind, reflorestando las mentes. They brought a 40-person delegation from Brazil. And that is massive, considering that we're in a global pandemic, that we are still in a global pandemic, and that many of those people had to come 2 weeks before to quarantine to be able to be here is just means that they spent a month away from their families, from their community. That's not just a commitment. That is life or death. And that's what we're here about. This is a life and death situation. So I don't know how much more time I have, but what's being negotiated right now is not going to end up being what we really want. So many of us haven't seen each other for 2 years, and this was a chance for us to come together, and it has been an opportunity for us to reconnect and re-strategize and stand with each other, whether it was standing with Indigenous women of the Brazilian Amazon, attending their events, or standing with the indigenous women of North America, of Turtle Island, to stand with the sisters who are of the missing and murdered indigenous women. We have been standing together at every moment. We've been advocating and amplifying, and there's been too many events to count. And that's a beautiful thing. I think that I really want to appreciate the people of Glasgow and the people of Scotland who have really shown their solidarity and have come out full force to support the climate justice movement. I mean, on Saturday, there was some people say 100,000, some people say 200,000, but there was a massive, massive march. And people came out, and indigenous people were in front, indigenous people of the North and South, and the East and West. And that was beautiful. That was beautiful to see. And that's why we're here, to build that unity and build that strength, to continue to advocate for protecting Mother Earth. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Layla. That was beautiful. And it strikes me as I listen to you that it almost feels as though the multinational extractive industries are like the puppeteers pulling the strings of whoever's on the inside at the trade show. And that, as both you and Ariel have said, it's like it all comes down to money and measurements, not life and people. And it's a crazy, crazy disconnect. Osprey, I wonder what you'd care to add to the mix, my friend.
Well, it's truly an honor to be here with you, Nina, and my sisters, Ariel and Layla. We've been to many COPs, actually all of us together, and feeling the solidarity of all of the sisters that work here, all the women that work here, is really powerful. I think that it is really interesting to see that this particular COP, partially because of the pandemic, but also because the acceleration of the climate crisis itself has gotten so much more severe than 2 years ago when we were at the COP in Madrid. The intensity is quite palatable here in a very different way. And I think that everyone really feels that, the intensity of action being needed. There's been so much talk. This is COP26, 26 years later. And as several of the women on our delegation said, if they would just get out of the way and let the women handle this, we would just get this done. So there's a lot of frustration happening on the inside because we are hearing a lot of the same rhetoric that we've heard for years. And it really does boil down to this sense of corporate greed, political power, political hubris, and this long historical pattern that humanity is in that we're really, many of us, trying to break. This cycle of white supremacy, colonization, capitalism, patriarchy, that has been going on for many hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's interesting being in Scotland. I've been talking to some Scots because in many ways, as themselves at one point an Indigenous people, they have been colonized. And this whole topic of colonization and ownership of land and the different ways that we have seen financial institutions grow over time. At one point, it wasn't fossil fuels. It was different forms of financial institutions and colonization and domination over everyday people. Those systems of oppression have continued. And now we are really in the end moment. We are at the crossroads where the intersection of these different systems of oppression have really played themselves out to the point where humanity is now looking at our own extinction. And it's not only unjust, what is happening, because of course, due to white supremacy and racism and colonization, the people being impacted first and worst are Indigenous people, are women, are Black and Brown communities, are Global South communities, are island nation peoples. And the wealthy countries and the corporations and the financial institutions and the powers that be are, sort of continuing to position themselves as if there's a way out, if they could just, continue to play out business as usual, that they somehow will avoid this crisis. So there's a terrible injustice happening here, but it's not just unjust, it's insane. There's a level of insanity to this that is really hard to grasp. And so I think one of the things that we do by working both on the inside of the COP, on the outside, is to work towards balance and sanity and trying to bring the voices of people from the ground who are experiencing the impact and bringing them directly to speak with policymakers, to speak with negotiators, to speak with ministers and parliamentarians, and to try to get this way grounded down to the earth, to the water, to the forests, to our food, to our children, to our communities, to life, and not in this game of numbers. And as Ariel mentioned, really so much of what's going on here, and Leila as well in the trade show, is that there's really a desire to continue these same economic structures of endless economic growth, and the fossil fuel industry being, absolutely key. We know from a Global Witness report, why we're here at the COP, that the largest delegation, larger than any country, are fossil fuel lobbyists, the largest delegation here. So that tells you a lot about who's operating in these spaces. And 60 of the largest banks in the world have collectively financed $3.8 trillion in fossil fuel companies since the Paris Agreement. So since we all decided that we are going to have, meet the 1.5 degree target, there's been $3.8 trillion put into financing fossil fuels. And governments right now around the world are going to double the amount of fossil fuel extraction that they're allowing by 2030. That would be double the amount consistent with a 1.5 degree target. And I know it's hard to talk wonky about numbers, and I don't mean to go down that road too far, but the reason I bring it up is because they are impossible numbers. They're completely impossible numbers. And so that's the frustration of people moving around all these different numbers and having all of these different policy conversations when the entire framework is set for collapse, is set for destruction, is set for burning the planet. At a certain point of temperature rise, plants can't even photosynthesize anymore. We won't have food. We won't have water. So the voices of frontline communities, of Indigenous peoples, of Black and Brown peoples, people from the Global South are so key because those impacts are already happening in their communities. And, as Leila said too, I'm in California. I mean, my lungs are totally changed. They're not what they were, years ago. And I know it's because of the fires. And all of us have different experiences of how, we're in this transition. It's already happening. And so I think it's incredibly important that we are applying pressure to governments, applying pressure to the financial institutions, and calling for them to really change their framework. And, they always tell us we're being naive because we are demanding that they move out of the system that they're in. And we keep reminding them that the system that they're in is a death sentence. It's a death sentence, and especially for frontline communities. And we won't allow for that. We won't stand for sacrifice zones. We will not stand for sacrifice peoples. We don't accept that. And that's what we're really pushing for, is to say, we will not allow there to be harms to communities that are not wealthy. We will not allow for this. And this is now really what we're looking at, is how to bring justice to this situation and to look for real solutions. And so I think what's really exciting is that, as we are building both inside and outside the COP, the conversation of the that the climate justice movement has grown in the last 2 years. The strategy depth, the fact of what is going on in terms of food sovereignty, the conversation about land back to Indigenous peoples, the conversation about what is, our cultural roots. I've had a lot of different, really in-depth, interesting conversations with people who are non-Indigenous about their own ancestral roots and how that healing is so important, because when you are really caught in the system of white supremacy, a lot of that white supremacy, one, is being really something that continues to be hung on to because of the privilege it offers white people. But also the other end of it is the terror of not having an identity. And that identity has been stolen. And that identity for white people to understand their ancestral roots is also part of this hungry ghost that feeds and continues to drive a need for economic growth and other systems of external power for a lack of well-being internally. So I've had some really interesting conversations about not only the inside and the outside in terms of the politics of inside the COP negotiations and the outside building climate justice power, but our own interiority, our own inside. What is happening to us as human beings as we face an existential threat to ourselves? What does it mean for us to transform ourselves in this moment? And the last thing I'll say to just really speak to this moment is we also know that there needs to be real reparations for frontline communities. And one of the things that we're really talking about is this $100 billion that has been promised to help the just transition, to help the Global South communities, those who have done the least to bring about the climate crisis. And it's just, again, another part of the insane scenario that there are trillions of dollars going to, as an example, our military budgets. But where's the $100 billion to care for people? And so we're really also calling for this care economy, a feminist economic structure that really cares for people and community. So we're really demanding from governments, one, who's going to stand up to the fossil fuel industry? Where are the government leaders going to stand up to this industry? And two, where's the $100 billion? And how is that really going to be distributed so that there can be care for frontline communities who really need these funds to make the transition? So there's some really practical things that we can do and we can fight for. But I think it's also really understanding that this climate crisis is happening externally, but it's also happening internally. And if we're going to dismantle these structures that we're facing, it's going to be at many layers and many levels, from our personal lives to our political lives to what it is that we're fighting for.
Thank you, Osprey. That was awesome. And thanks to all three of you. Your styles of communication are so complementary, and really together the three of you have sketched out a picture of what it's like there on the ground. And I need to say, for anybody who may not have seen it, if you go onto YouTube and look for Patti Smith, I think on Saturday or Friday, she gave a concert for 30,000 people there in Glasgow and sang Power to the People. And it moves me to tears every time I watch it. And as I listen to you, Osprey, it also occurs to me that, the $100 billion that's going into the military is the greatest emitter of carbon right now. So defunding the military is part of how we get the money to transform the society and do some reparations into the communities that really need it. And as I listen to the three of you, I'm inclined to roll two questions into one and invite you in any sequence you feel called to answer, but maybe we can go the same sequence again, because that worked well. Each of you work focusing on the frontline actions of Indigenous peoples and on leveraging their voices. And so here's the two-part question. One is, why is that so central to your strategies? But the second part of the question, which I would invite you to address, is why are the financial solutions that they're bandying about so awful? You know, the climate trading, the, carbon offsets. I mean, all of those ways that translate changing the economy into dollars and cents. Would each of you, as you address why frontline Indigenous peoples are central, also speak to that to just help make it really apparent to everyone who's joining us? Ariel, you want to start us off?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. When we're talking about the false solutions that are proliferating these spaces and creating this illusion that we're moving towards addressing the climate crisis is a real problem, because when we're giving people this illusion that everything can be exactly as it is and we can maintain the status quo and move forward as long as we do A, B, and C. I think when we have this as the foundation of how we're going to be building solutions, we really have to question that, because again, the military is the biggest polluter on the planet. We are seeing the rainforest cut down. We're seeing the boreal forest being cut down. I also need to state this because it's a very contentious fact that a lot of people don't know, but the Canadian boreal forest is actually the fastest deforesting. Canada is the fastest deforesting nation in the world. We are deforesting faster than the Amazon rainforest, and we don't talk about it. We don't talk about the fact that that's the case because it's in Canada. It seems endless, and we have a democratic government. We are seeing the G7 nations continue to say we want to do our part to effectively address the climate crisis by proposing technological solutions, techno fixes. We're talking about that because they want to control what those solutions are, because they don't want to let go of the power dynamics and the structures of economy that they hold all of the nations of the world hostage under. We are economic hostages, and we have become climate hostages as well. And so when we talk about a climate justice framework, it does not reduce the climate crisis to a puzzle simply focused on carbon counting. It's grassroots, community-led movements from around the world and then we look past the economy. We look at the exploitation of land, labor, and the living systems. We look at the erosion of seed, soil, story, spirit, and seek to uplift real solutions around us every day. From traditional ecological knowledge, food sovereignty, the decommodification of land, healthcare, and housing, to abolishing the military-industrial complex, seeking to extract the last dredges of fossil fuels from Mother Earth. From just transition and energy and democracy, where democratized, decentralized, detoxified, and decarbonized energy powers our lives, to transformative justice, where we respond to violence and trauma with compassion and healing, not policing, punishment, and prisons. Because what's coming out of these discussions right now are false solutions that are doing exactly the opposite of that. We are saying developing nations don't get to have the same lives as us because we want to maintain the status quo in the Western society, in the G7 states. And we're talking about putting forward solutions to just offset. So carbon offset mechanisms are a big thing right now. And for folks to understand, because, it does feel good when you are booking a flight or you purchase something and it says, would you like to contribute money to planting trees? Of course, that feels good. We want to do that. But what is it actually contributing to? Of course, we need more trees. Of course, we should be protecting biodiversity. But the reality is it's allowing things to continue business as usual. The IPCC has stated time and time again that we need to actually reduce emissions. Since Kyoto, the Kyoto Agreement, which was put forward that mechanism that has sort of allowed us to think we just need to offset. It was called the Clean Development Mechanism. And since the Kyoto Agreement, global emissions have actually increased by 9%. This is proof that carbon offsets and trading of emissions actually doesn't work. So now we're looking at trading conservation. We're talking about trading land, our carbon sinks. So we're talking about now creating systems of sacrifice zones to create business as usual. The big thing that's being talked about here is an international or a global carbon trading mechanism. That would mean that in my territory where they're extracting the Alberta tar sands, those companies and corporations could offset their emissions by protecting a piece of rainforest in the Amazon. And while that will be good, like that sounds great for the Amazon, people are like, well, we need to save the Amazon. That would be great. And it's being sold to these communities under this really beautiful, oh, we'll pay you to live on the land as you always have. However, the dangers of conservation offsets, or what is being coined as nature-based solutions, is actually not what it appears. Because in order for that offset to become valuable, the biodiversity needs to increase. And these corporations then own the land. They are now title holders to Indigenous lands and territories, and they have a vested interest in actually driving us off of our lands and territories. They say, oh, actually, you can't harvest there during these seasons. You can't access during this. You can't pick those medicines because we need the biodiversity to increase. Because the one thing that is so psychotic about it is they don't see the humanity as part of the biodiversity. Mm-hmm. We are actually part of it. There have been studies to show how Indigenous relationships and life ways in relationships with our lands and territories actually leads towards increased biodiversity and increased quality of life for women and children, increased local economies, increased language and culture that drives us even deeper into relationship with land. And so when we commodify these things and we remove that human relationship to the land, it just is serving capitalist models. It's allowing big polluters to continue, digging up the tar sands or the Bakken oil fields or any of the Permian oil fields. We're talking about the psychotic nature that's allowing these things to move forward. And those are the huge dangers. But again, going back to that articulation on a climate justice framework, we really have to talk about the fact that those frameworks are really built on the fact that we're not just talking about solutions because we think of a beautiful world together, but we have had to bear the brunt, like Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander, migrant, and poor communities, women and gender non-binary folks. We're the first and foremost to be impacted by climate change, from storms to floods to sea level rise to forest fires, droughts, and the melting ice in the Arctic region. So we have bared the brunt, pollution, poverty, police violence, and criminalization. As we've defended our communities, as we've defended our lands and territories from colonial extractive economies that are driving the climate crisis. And yet we are bringing forward the knowledge and the solutions that are rooted in our community, that don't want to be reliant on those extractive economies and systems that have twisted and perverted our relationships with each other and the land. And that's where that real power comes from, that real community organizing, that we can move forward and be guided by shared principles and a common vision of restoring our relations with the earth and with each other.
Thank you, Ariel. Layla, want to jump in?
Wow, I think Ariel broke it down pretty good. But I'll just add that what's been beautiful here in Glasgow is, we really cannot go anywhere inside or outside the COP without feeling that presence of Indigenous peoples. I really feel that this, I don't know if Osprey and Ariel, you agree, but I do feel that there's the most Indigenous peoples that I've ever seen at a COP. And, I mentioned this before, but we're in the middle of a pandemic. And so why is that? I said earlier that it's because lives are on the line. We say rights, lands, territories. And what does that really mean for the Amazon? In the Amazon rainforest, well, we all know that the Amazon rainforest is the most biologically diverse tropical rainforest on the planet. And it is a source of life on this planet. And it also is the hydrological cycle of our planet. It feeds the hydrological cycle of our planet. It's not just a carbon sink. And in fact, it's not a carbon sink anymore. The Amazon rainforest is at a tipping point. That means it's at the point at which it is not functioning as a rainforest, as a rainforest anymore. It's at that crucial point. And it's not the only one, right? There's ecosystem collapses happening all over our planet. And yet, those places where the ecosystem collapses are happening or can be avoided from happening, the best insurance, you could say, for securing and ensuring that those sacred places, really, what we're talking about are the sacred places on our planet. They are safeguarded. They are defended, protected, guarded by Indigenous peoples and have been for thousands of years. And so that is why we stand with Indigenous peoples. And that is what our ancestors would want us to do. We always, we say that our ancestors are watching us and have been waiting for us for this moment, for us to be doing this work. And we are at that tipping point all over the world where we need to take a stand, and we need to take a stand with the Indigenous peoples who are on the front lines of the most sacred places on our planet, whether it be the Amazon or the Boreal. Also, no longer a carbon sink because of the deforestation, because of the destruction, because of the desecration of Mother Earth. And so we stand with Indigenous peoples because Indigenous peoples protect and defend life. And in the Amazon, the best protected places in the Amazon are not national parks, are not protected areas. Governments still drill for oil. They still mine. They still build hydroelectric dams on national parks, like Yasuni National Park. It is Indigenous territories that are the best protected. That is where people are putting their bodies on the line. That is why thousands, the biggest Indigenous mobilization in history took place in August and September in Brazil, because the Bolsonaro government is not only attacking and setting afire the Amazon, but also attacking and killing Indigenous peoples. And enough is enough. And a few months back, I was talking to our friend and colleague, sister, Jade Begay, and we were discussing the Land Back campaign of NDN Collective and Indigenous peoples of the North. And I said, this is what, our brothers and sisters in the Amazon in Brazil are saying. They're saying demarcação já. And demarcation now means give us our land back. It means we want our land, our territorial recognition now, not later. We want it now because we are at the tipping point. We are being attacked. We don't want the Constitution changed so that you can take our land and turn it into soy plantations and cattle grazing lands. We want our land back. And I'll just end by saying that I want to read to you what APIB put out this week, which is the land back statement from Brazil, from the indigenous peoples of Brazil. And they say that indigenous land is a guarantee of the future for all humanity. Our relationship with territory is not one of ownership, exploitation, expropriation, or appropriation, but one of respect and management of a common good, which serves all humanity as barricades to the extractive dynamics that cause the climate crisis. Until today, based on reports from the UN and several research institutes with the highest reputation that Western science can demand, it is we indigenous peoples who are the most responsible for the preservation of the biomes of the planet. And therefore, we stand against the false solutions based on technological innovations. And it goes on. So that is why we stand with indigenous peoples in defense of life, in defense of Mother Earth, and against those false solutions.
And it strikes me as I listen to you that we all need spin decoders right now, because the spin is so dangerous. And Osprey, I'm going to hand it to you, but ask you to be quite concise. And if you could fold into your answer, please, helping respond to a question by Mayor Steinberg, who asks, will you explain net zero versus zero?
Sure. I wanted to just also voice how important the Indigenous women here have been, Indigenous peoples, as Ariel and Layla have already stated. But I also wanted to just give a special shout out to a lot of the Indigenous youth women leaders and Two-Spirit leaders that are here, and the Indigenous women elders. They have been so powerful in the different actions, the different press conferences. And, one of the things that Casey Camp-Hornick spoke to me about, who is a Ponca Nation elder, is the rise of the matriarchy again. And we had a long discussion about the matriarchal nature of Indigenous peoples, and the beauty and the power of the women's societies. And I just wanted to surface that because I think it's really important. And we've been saying all along that Indigenous peoples are a climate solution. And to highlight that, one of the things that we're bringing to the table is the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which includes something called free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC. And this is an international standard that is not one that is recognized by governments. They don't implement it, even though they have agreed to it. And I think we don't have time to go into that, but I think it's really important for people to understand, as we're talking about where the last water is, where the last forests are, the last clean water, this biodiversity that is so precious that Indigenous peoples have cared for and are putting their bodies on the line, are dying for. Our sisters up on line 3 in the United States having rubber bullets shot at them. This goes back to Standing Rock, and it goes on and on. People being criminalized and murdered for standing up for their territories and land. That Indigenous peoples have unique rights. Free, prior, informed consent means that they have the right to say no. And one of the things that we've been really speaking about to governments and financial institutions who finance these fossil fuel companies or finance deforestation is, when is no, no? Can you start seeing no as a response and implement free, prior, informed consent and continue to stop this colonial practice of not respecting treaty rights, not respecting the land? So it's another aspect of land back, is to really look at who has consent over what happens on Indigenous lands. And I think that's a very key solution we need to lift up. We've also been here with the 5th International Rights of Nature Tribunal. And I think that's another component that is based on, a modern idea of how to transform our systems of law. But it's really also based on Indigenous knowledge, this idea that Mother Earth is alive. And how do we translate that fact of the beautiful web of life, the living fact of our rivers, our mountains, our oceans, all of the plants and animals, and how do we translate that into a modern system of law so that we can protect the rights of nature, the rights of Mother Earth, the rights of Pachamama. And I particularly love the saying of one Indigenous elder that I had spent time with in New Zealand from the Wanganui River. And they have a saying that she shared with me when we went to the Wanganui River, when I went to visit there on a delegation. I am the river and the river is me. I am the river and the river is me. And it's this very different worldview that Indigenous peoples bring us about this relationship, where it's not metaphorical that the river is their ancestor, but the river is their ancestor. That's where they come from. And this relationship that we really need to build with Mother Earth, with life, is something we can learn so much from Indigenous peoples who have maintained that traditional knowledge. So I wanted to just uplift that. And getting back to this net zero question, is we are demanding zero and not net zero, because net zero is part of the false solution schemes. And it's another way of, as Ariel was talking about before, talking about these different carbon offset mechanisms. So there's different ways that you can achieve net zero, but in essence, it's a way of delaying action and stopping pollution right now at the source, so that you can figure out your calculations of how much carbon emissions you're emitting by doing carbon offsets, as Ariel was talking about, where you can buy carbon offsets through a forest someplace else. And then you can balance your books and say, oh, well, we're doing this sort of polluting here, but we're really achieving net zero because we did carbon offsets, even though we're doing pollution in our company or our corporation or through a government now. And so, sometimes people will hear Greta Thunberg talk about fancy accounting, and this is what she's talking about, how people are simply moving around numbers and they're not really achieving real zero emissions. They're achieving net zero, which again is just another accounting mechanism for governments and financial institutions to hide their emissions and not actually take responsibility for them now. And so this is why we really need to continue to call out net zero, nature-based solutions, RED and RED Plus. All of them are the same thing, which is to keep moving business as usual and not have to actually do the hard work, which is that some of the people who are making a lot of money right now are going to have to shift into clean energy, renewable energy, or they're going to have to shut their business down. And this is what they don't want to do, just to put it in blunt terms. And so again, I think one of the biggest rub that we're seeing here, even the International Energy Agency, which is super conservative, has told governments, has told financial institutions, have told the fossil fuel industry, we have to stop. We have to stop extracting oil. We have to stop expansion of oil. And everything you can imagine is being concocted, like net zero, to push that further down the road and not take responsibility for actually cutting emissions now and stopping extraction now. And this is what we're facing, and this is what's going on tonight. There's negotiations going on tonight about this very topic. And it is something that, there will be many demonstrations about, I'm sure, tomorrow, because, people's movements are not going to have this. They're not going to accept these false solutions, net zero, and the continuation of these carbon trading schemes. They're just not going to accept it because it is hurting our earth, it is hurting our communities, and it is not the solution that we need.
Just a fancy way of kicking the can down the road, so to speak. which, every day that we delay is more danger, and more damage and more irreversible harm. So I'm aware that we're getting some really great questions. I'm wishing we had more time. Lila has just put something in our private chat, which I'm hoping Marita can share. Here's what I'm going to do, ladies. I am going to combine some of these questions. Trust that you are skillful enough and resourceful enough to answer what really speaks to you. Trust that if you don't, one of your sisters will. And so here's how I want to invite us to take the next 10 minutes or so. One question that I was going to ask each of you is, what is your best vision of what you think can actually tip it? Even though it may be radical and wild. One question which Terry McKenzie asked from Portland is, how do you think we can break through the colonial mindset to save the planet? And another question which Kathy asked, Kathy Neidhart, which I think speaks to each of you, is, she said, if we don't have connections with Indigenous people where we are, or anywhere, how specifically can we help and be allies and support the work that you're all doing? So I'm going to invite you each. Let's share it and see if we can do 2 or 3 minutes apiece, and start with Ariel. And again, you don't have to answer all 3. Answer what speaks to you. Trust that between the 3 of us, 4 of us, we've got it. And Ariel, where would you begin? Whoops.
Vision. Oh, there. I think maybe just a vision. I put on my net zero sticker because I think that's really important. No net zero, but a vision for tomorrow. I think like how we get to where we need to go. I feel like it might answer a little bit of questions. I think that we need to be decolonizing. How do we release ourselves from the colonial mindset? And my vision for tomorrow are the same answer. We really need to be talking about decolonization, and people get really confused and overwhelmed by the concept of decolonization, but it's really quite simple. In its basic root forms, it's a return of and connections to land. And what that amounts to, though, in a more constructive way, is that a lot of the time Indigenous systems and value systems are validated by the colonial structures. So when we want to conserve our lands and territories, it's through a colonial conservation process. It does not actually uplift systems of self-determination as defined by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Article 3. Take a look and look it up. So in order for us to move towards decolonization, we have to talk about how our systems aren't being validated by those systems, but how colonial systems are being validated by Indigenous systems that have been around for a very long time. This will require deconstruction and an undoing of current systems to create space for our systems. And so we're not saying get rid of everything completely. I mean, some might. Sometimes I feel that way, but I also have met some incredible, amazing allies that are part of these colonial structures, and we just have to undo all of those horrible things and make room for more. And I do want to add one more thing. If you live in North America or Turtle Island, you live on Indigenous land. So if you're not in touch or engaged with those Indigenous communities, the first thing I ask you to do is, and don't look to somewhere else, because it's very easy for us to look to faraway places to work with Indigenous peoples. I absolutely love the work of Amazon Watch, but there are Indigenous peoples in North America that you can be working with. So just remember, decolonizing our minds is about deconstructing the current systems and making room for more. There's enough room for all of us at the table. And going to the two wampum treaties of early colonization in Eastern Canada, they said that we don't all have to be on the same boat. We just have to be going in the same direction. We can be on completely different structures as long as we are moving in the same direction side by side as equals. That's how we move forward in deep relationship. That's how we respect each other's systems and structures and move forward towards progress. And that is my vision of tomorrow, where Indigenous knowledge systems are valued at the same level as colonial white supremacist societies. I mean, get rid of white supremacy. Let's get rid of that. But we need to have that equality.
Thank you, Ariel. And I feel like I want to add that for me, decolonizing myself means a continual process of peeling back layers of enculturated learning that have a tendency to become unconscious, but that perpetuate systems of racism, systems of white supremacy, systems of capitalism and colonialism. So that if we can decolonize ourselves, then we can work to decolonize the systems. And similarly, the other thing I just wanted to add is that there are Indigenous struggles for sacred land and water happening all over North and South America. And if you live in North America, you can lobby your government representatives. You can use your voice and your white privilege to stand with Indigenous peoples to help protect their lands. So let me pass it to Layla, and thank you, Ariel.
I agree with everything you all said. And it is, it is a process. Every single one of us has to work on that. Every single one of us has been colonized in some way, shape, or form, or assimilated as well. And so we are all working to break free from that. And so just a few concrete actions that you can take from anywhere you are. We do need to defund extraction. We need to defund. We need to decolonize. We need to defund. We need to defund this extractive model. And we cannot protect the Amazon, for example, if we keep destroying it. So we need an immediate moratorium on continued extraction. We need zero deforestation, no net zero deforestation. A colleague today, Pablo Solon, who used to be a negotiator for the Bolivian government, said that in Copenhagen, and years ago, there was a pledge for zero deforestation by 2020. And right now, they didn't make that. The governments did not meet that pledge. And now they're talking about zero deforestation, net deforestation by 2030. So no nets. We need zero deforestation. For the Amazon, we are working in alliance and in basically responding to the calls of Indigenous peoples and scientists to call for the permanent protection of 80% of the Amazon by 2025. We hear a lot of talk about pledges by 2030. And that's too far away. For the Amazon, there's already 30% of the Amazon protected by Indigenous peoples. Another 20% is protected areas, and another 20% have been deforested and degraded. Sorry for all the numbers, but basically that adds up to 80% of the Amazon needs permanent protection, 100% of Indigenous peoples' lands. So that is the big meta goal that we're working on here, that we're calling for. And there have been a lot of governments saying that they want to support that. So we want to see that in action. Permanent protection of the Amazon by 2025. That's what we're working towards.
Thank you, Layla. And I'm sorry you're so tired, and I hope you get some rest, my friend. I know it's not looming close, but thank you so much. And Osprey, would you like to cap us off here?
Thank you so much. It's just really an honor to be with everyone. What I want to say is that I really want to bring us back to this gender issue for a moment, because I agree with all of what has been said about decolonization, defunding the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network. We have a really big divestment campaign that's also very involved with Indigenous women's leadership. I want to point out that it's really important to know, just statistically, and we don't have time for numbers, but we actually can't get to climate solutions without women's leadership. It has been shown, study after study, that you cannot actually get to sustainability without women's leadership. And this is really important because the violence against the earth and violence against the women are interlocking. And this is a very long-standing framework of patriarchy and colonization that we've been talking about in this discussion. And I really want us to break free from this violence, this abuse and violence against the earth and women, and the extraction of the land and the abuse of women. They are deeply intertwined, and we need to really uplift women and uplift Mother Earth at the same time, and understand that deep cultural pain and burden that has to be healed. And we need to be both warrioresses and healers as we make our way through this time frame. And one of the things just about this particular COP for people to know is when the UK presidency, because every time there's a COP, the location where it's held has a presidency. There were no women leaders in the UK presidency in major positions. And it took a lot of women in a collective campaign to say, there's no way we're going to go into this COP unless you put some women into position. And it has improved, but not enough. And it just goes to show you that, these systems that we are fighting are continuing. And many times we can forget that if we don't look at the root causes and really dig into the root causes, we can't really get to the deeper healing. And so I want to lift up again just the incredible women that are on this call and sharing this incredible work we've been doing together, and to be together and struggle as we bring healing from this terrible violence that has a historical foundation that we need to heal.
Thank you so much, Osprey. And I'm reminded that, for anyone who has seen Paul Hawken's Project Drawdown, where he worked with hundreds of researchers to identify the 100 top climate drawdown strategies. Basically, they identified both educating women and girls and women's reproductive rights and women's leadership as two of the foremost strategies for reducing carbon emissions. And it's so true. There are researchers who say that gender bias is the deepest bias in the human psyche. And we do need women. We also need men to stand with us and by us. And for any of you watching who are in the US, please know that our president could stop Enbridge Corporation's Line 3 with the stroke of a pen. And in fact, he's not. So, we're getting a lot of lip service, not a lot of action. And I just want to really bow down to the work that all three of you are doing there at COP and throughout the rest of the year. And really thank you for making the time to be with us today. And thank you, everyone who's joining and watching.